The poor student who picked up a hitchhiker never guessed he was a billionaire in disguise. But then again, life had never been particularly generous with its revelations to Ethan James. Rain pelted against the cracked windshield of his ancient Honda Civic, each drop a small reminder of all the repairs he couldn't afford. The wipers, ancient and protesting with every swipe, fought a losing battle against the November downpour. Ethan's fingers trembled slightly on the steering wheel, not just from the cold seeping through the car's inadequate heating system, but from exhaustion. 3 jobs, full-time classes, and the constant gnawing worry about next month's rent had hollowed him out. The dashboard clock glowed 11:42 p.m., almost midnight, and still 2 hours from home after his late shift at the warehouse. His eyes burned. Coffee had stopped working hours ago. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof like impatient fingers. Through the blur, he almost missed the solitary figure standing at the roadside, thumb extended, shoulders hunched against the deluge. "No way!" Ethan muttered, his tired brain cataloging all the reasons not to stop. Serial killers, robbers, the fact that his car might break down from the sheer audacity of taking on additional weight. And yet, the figure, a man Ethan could now see, wore no rain jacket, just a dark suit plastered to his frame. Something about the dignified way he stood there, drenched and yet somehow unbowed, made Ethan's foot ease off the accelerator. He remembered another rainy night 3 years ago, when no one had stopped for him after his bus connection failed. 8 miles in the rain had cost him his textbooks, his laptop, and had sickened him for weeks. With a sigh that fogged the windshield, Ethan pulled over. The man approached quickly but not hurriedly, maintaining that same dignified bearing, despite being soaked to the skin. When he opened the passenger door, Ethan was surprised to see someone older than expected, perhaps in his 60s, with silver hair plastered to his temples and deep lines around eyes that somehow remained alert and appraising. "Thank you," the man said simply, settling into the seat. His voice carried no particular accent, but something in its timbre suggested authority, the habitual expectation of being listened to. "Where are you headed?" Ethan asked, pulling back onto the empty highway. The heater wheezed pathetically, struggling to dispel the new wave of cold air. "Whichever direction you're going would be appreciated," the man said, examining his sodden sleeves with mild disappointment. "My car broke down several miles back. No cell service." Ethan nodded, recognizing the dead zones that plagued this stretch of rural highway. "I'm headed to Lakeside. It's about 2 hours ahead." "Perfect," the stranger replied, though something in his tone suggested that nothing about his current situation approached perfection. Silence settled between them, broken only by the rhythmic swishing of the overtaxed wipers and the persistent drumming of rain. Ethan stifled a yawn, blinking hard to keep his focus on the slick road ahead. "You should rest," the man said suddenly. "You're exhausted." Ethan smiled thinly. "Not really an option while driving. There's a diner about 10 miles ahead," the stranger said. "Perhaps we could stop. I owe you a coffee at minimum for the rescue." Ethan hesitated. The delay would push his arrival home to almost 3 a.m., leaving just 4 hours before his morning shift at the cafe. But the allure of caffeine and the legitimate fear of falling asleep at the wheel won out. "Yeah, okay. Thanks." The man nodded, then glanced at the textbook peeking from Ethan's backpack on the back seat. "You're a student? Engineering at Westlake. Senior year." Ethan gripped the wheel tighter as a gust of wind buffeted the car. "Impressive program," the man remarked. "Difficult to get into." Ethan shrugged. "Harder to stay in when you're working 3 jobs." The words came out more bitterly than he'd intended, and he immediately regretted them. The stranger, however, seemed unoffended. 3 jobs in engineering? That speaks to exceptional determination. Or exceptional desperation, Ethan countered with a half laugh. The man turned slightly in his seat. In the dim light from the dashboard, his eyes were unexpectedly keen. In my experience, the two are not mutually exclusive. Something about his gaze made Ethan uncomfortable, as though those eyes could see beyond his threadbare jacket and exhausted posture to the fears that kept him awake at night. The mounting student loans, the apartment he could barely afford, the constant calculations of which bill could be delayed this month. The all-night diner appeared through the rain like a fluorescent mirage, its bright lights reflecting in puddles across the nearly empty parking lot. Ethan guided his protesting car into a space near the entrance. Inside, the diner maintained that peculiar timelessness of all late-night establishments. Aging vinyl booths, the scent of coffee and grease, and a waitress who'd seen it all. She greeted them with practiced disinterest as they settled into a booth by the window, rain still streaming down the glass. "Coffee black," the stranger ordered, then looked at Ethan expectantly. "Same." And, Ethan hesitated, quickly calculating his remaining budget for the week. "We'll have 2 of your breakfast specials as well," the man interjected smoothly. When the waitress departed, he added to Ethan, "I insist. You're doing me a significant favor tonight." Ethan wanted to refuse. He'd been raised never to take handouts, but the hollow ache in his stomach betrayed him. His last meal had been a hastily eaten sandwich 12 hours ago. "Thanks, Mr. Morgan," the man supplied. "Richard Morgan." "And you are?" "Ethan James." Richard nodded, removing his wetsuit jacket and draping it carefully on the bench beside him. Despite his disheveled state, he emanated a strange composure, as if being stranded in a rainstorm and rescued by a stranger in a barely functioning car was merely an unexpected diversion rather than a crisis. Their coffee arrived steaming and bitter. Ethan wrapped his hands around the mug, savoring the warmth against his perpetually cold fingers. "Tell me, Ethan," Richard said after taking a sip, "what kind of engineering captures your interest?" "Environmental systems," Ethan replied, "specifically water purification technologies for developing regions." Richard's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Not the most lucrative specialty. Not everything is about money," Ethan said, then immediately felt foolish. Easy to say when you'd grown up without it. Harder to maintain when facing a lifetime of debt. But Richard smiled, the first real smile since entering the car. Refreshing perspective. "What drew you to that field?" Ethan hesitated. He rarely shared this story, but something about the lateness of the hour and the strangeness of the situation loosened his usual reserve. "My mom was a nurse with Doctors Without Borders. She took me to Guatemala when I was 14, during a water crisis there." He stared into his coffee. "I watched children get sick, some die from preventable waterborne diseases. But I also saw how a simple filtration system transformed an entire village. Engineering that actually saves lives seemed worth pursuing." Richard's eyes had grown intent. "Your mother sounds remarkable." "She was," Ethan said softly. The past tense hung between them, acknowledged by Richard with a small nod. Their food arrived, eggs, bacon, toast, and Ethan realized just how hungry he'd been. They ate in companionable silence for several minutes. "And now you're working 3 jobs to complete your degree?" Richard finally said. "That suggests the path hasn't been easy." Ethan shrugged, pushing eggs around his plate. "Mom's medical bills took everything. No relatives to help. But I'm managing. Barely, I suspect," Richard observed, his tone matter-of-fact rather than pitying. Ethan felt a flicker of defensiveness. "I'll graduate in May. Things will improve." "Perhaps," Richard conceded. "Though starting salaries in environmental engineering aren't comparable to other specialties, especially with the current economic climate." "I didn't ask for your assessment of my career prospects," Ethan said tightly. Richard studied him for a moment, then inclined his head slightly. "You're right. Forgive my presumption." The conversation lulled. Outside, the rain had finally begun to ease, leaving only a gentle patter against the windows. Ethan checked his watch. Almost 1 a.m. now. "We should probably get back on the road," he said, reaching for his wallet. Richard waved him off. "I told you this is my treat." He placed several bills on the table, more than enough to cover their modest meal and a generous tip. Back in the car, with warm food in his stomach and fresh coffee in his system, Ethan felt marginally more alive. The road stretched ahead, glistening under the headlights. "So what brings you out here in the middle of nowhere, Mr. Morgan?" Ethan asked, curiosity finally overcoming his reticence. Not exactly business traveler territory. Richard's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. "I was visiting a property I'm considering acquiring. The realtor insisted today was the only possible time. Must be some property to be worth the trip in this weather." "It has sentimental value," Richard said, looking out at the darkness beyond the window. "I grew up nearby, though in considerably different circumstances than my current situation." Something in his tone hinted at a story there, but Ethan didn't press. The miles rolled by, the silence between them now more comfortable than awkward. It was Richard who broke it next. "Tell me about your senior project." "For your engineering degree." Ethan's hands tightened on the wheel. His project, his passion, was the one bright spot in his exhausting existence. It's a low-cost filtration system using locally available materials in rural areas. Combines traditional sand filtration with some newer nanomaterials that can be produced with minimal equipment. As he warmed to the subject, Ethan found himself explaining the technical details, the challenges, the potential impact. Richard asked surprisingly insightful questions. revealing an unexpected depth of knowledge about both engineering principles and global water challenges. The prototype works, Ethan concluded, but scaling it would require resources I don't have. After graduation, I'm hoping to find a company willing to develop it further. Have you considered starting your own company? Richard asked. Ethan laughed outright. With what capital? My vast savings from delivering pizzas? Richard didn't smile. There are investors who fund promising innovations, particularly ones with humanitarian applications. Maybe in some alternate universe where I have connections or time to pitch to investors, Ethan said. Right now, I'm just trying to graduate without defaulting on my rent. Richard said nothing more, but Ethan could feel his gaze, thoughtful and assessing. An hour later, they approached the outskirts of Lakeside. The rain had stopped entirely, leaving a mist that hung just above the road surface, ethereal in the headlights. Where can I drop you? Ethan asked, stifling another yawn. The Grand Hotel would be fine, Richard replied. Ethan nearly swerved. The Grand? Are you serious? The Grand Hotel was Lakeside's most exclusive accommodation, perched on the lakeshore, with rooms that cost more per night than Ethan made in a week. Richard's expression remained impassive. Is it out of your way? No, it's just... Ethan shook his head. Never mind. 20 minutes later, he pulled up to the imposing entrance of the Grand. Despite the late hour, uniformed staff materialized immediately, one opening Richard's door while another hovered nearby. Thank you, Ethan, Richard said, retrieving his still damp jacket. You've been more helpful than you know. He reached into an inner pocket and extracted a business card, offering it with a steady hand. If you ever need assistance with your project or anything else, please contact me directly. Ethan accepted the card automatically, glancing down at the embossed lettering. Richard Morgan, CEO, Meridian Global Enterprises. His head snapped up, but Richard was already exiting the car. Through the open door, he added, sometimes the most valuable journeys are the ones we don't plan. Yeah, good night. The door closed with a solid thunk that seemed to underscore the quality difference between Ethan's car and everything associated with Richard Morgan. Ethan sat there, engine idling, as Richard was escorted inside with the deference reserved for the exceptionally wealthy. Only when a valet approached with a politely questioning expression did Ethan finally pull away, the business card burning a hole in his pocket. Ethan's apartment was exactly as depressing as he'd left it 14 hours earlier. Water stains mapped constellations across the ceiling. The ancient radiator clanked and sputtered while producing minimal heat, and the furnishings, all secondhand or salvaged, sagged with exhausted resignation. He dropped his keys on the scratched coffee table and collapsed onto the couch, too tired even to make it to the bedroom. The business card was still in his hand, its raised lettering catching the dim light from the single lamp. Meridian Global Enterprises. Even Ethan, disconnected as he was from the business world, recognized the name. A technology and infrastructure conglomerate with interests across multiple continents, worth billions. He pulled out his phone, ignoring the time, almost 3 a.m. now, in search for Richard Morgan. The images that appeared matched the man who'd sat in his passenger seat. Silver hair, keen eyes, the same dignified bearing. But in these photos, Richard wore impeccable suits in wood-paneled boardrooms or stood at podiums addressing rapt audiences. Forbes listed his net worth at just over $12 billion. Ethan let the phone drop onto his chest, his exhausted brain struggling to reconcile the hitchhiker he'd picked up with the corporate titan on his screen. What were the chances? And more importantly, why had one of the richest men in the country been standing alone in the rain on a deserted highway? Sleep claimed him before he could find answers, the business card still clutched in his fingers. Morning arrived with cruel swiftness. Ethan's alarm jarred him awake at 7 a.m., his body protesting every movement as he forced himself upright. His shift at Lakeside Cafe started at 8, followed by classes from 11 to 3, then another shift at the campus bookstore until 7. On Wednesdays, he'd normally head to the warehouse after that, but they'd cut his hours this week, a blessing and a curse. As he showered in the tepid water that was his apartment's version of hot, Ethan tried to process the previous night's encounter. In the harsh light of morning, it seemed almost dreamlike. Would a billionaire really be hitchhiking alone on a rural highway? Even if his car had broken down, surely someone like Richard Morgan would have resources. A driver, a security team, something. Ethan dressed quickly in the cafe's required khakis and polo, both showing signs of too many washings. The business card sat on his coffee table where he'd placed it before collapsing into bed. On impulse, he pocketed it before heading out. The Lakeside Cafe catered to the town's more affluent residents and tourists, its lakefront location and artisanal menu allowing it to charge prices that Ethan himself could never afford on his barista's wages. The morning rush was predictable. Professionals grabbing coffee before work, retirees lingering over breakfast, the occasional tourist studying maps and guidebooks. Ethan moved on autopilot, his mind still caught between exhaustion and the surreal memory of his late-night passenger. Steam hissed, milk frothed, customers came and went in a blur of transactions. "Double espresso, please," a familiar voice said. Ethan's head snapped up from the espresso machine to find Richard Morgan standing at the counter, immaculate in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than a semester of Ethan's tuition. Gone was any trace of the rain-soaked traveler. This man exuded the quiet confidence that came with immense wealth and power. "Mr. Morgan," Ethan managed, aware of his manager hovering nearby, attuned to any hint of a VIP customer. "Good morning, Ethan," Richard replied, his tone as measured as it had been the night before. "I trust you got some rest." "Not enough," Ethan admitted, setting up the espresso shot. "But I'm used to it." Richard studied him with that same penetrating gaze. "I've been thinking about your filtration project. It has considerable potential." Ethan's hands stilled briefly before continuing their practiced movements. "Thank you," he said cautiously, aware of other customers waiting in line behind Richard. "I'd like to discuss it further," Richard continued, seemingly oblivious to the growing impatience behind him. "Perhaps you could spare an hour this evening." Ethan handed over the espresso. "I'm working until 7 at the campus bookstore." 7:30 then. "I'll send a car." It wasn't a question but a statement of fact, delivered with the calm assurance of someone unaccustomed to refusal. Before Ethan could respond, Richard placed a $20 bill in the tip jar, not the register, Ethan noted, and stepped aside, allowing the next customer to order. Throughout his remaining shift, through his classes where he struggled to focus, and during his hours restocking textbooks at the campus store, Ethan's mind kept returning to Richard's unexpected appearance and perplexing invitation. What could a billionaire CEO possibly want with a sleep-deprived engineering student and his unproven filtration system? At precisely 7:30 p.m., as Ethan emerged from the bookstore into the crisp November evening, a black town car idled at the curb. The driver, professionally neutral in expression, opened the rear door as Ethan approached. "Mr. James, Mr. Morgan is expecting you." Ethan hesitated, hyper-aware of his rumpled work clothes and the general dishevelment that came from a day spent on too little sleep. But curiosity, and if he was honest, a flicker of hope that this might somehow benefit his project, propelled him forward. The car's interior was all soft leather and hushed luxury. As they pulled away from campus, Ethan found himself unconsciously sitting straighter, as if the car itself demanded a certain posture. They drove not to the Grand Hotel as he'd expected, but to the lakeside, specifically to White Shore Estate, the most exclusive property in the area. Ethan had only seen it from a distance, its elegant Victorian architecture perched on a bluff overlooking the water, surrounded by carefully manicured grounds. The gates opened automatically as they approached, and the car followed a winding driveway through gardens now dormant for winter. When they stopped at the entrance, Ethan's door was opened by a woman in a simple but clearly expensive suit. "Mr. James, welcome. I'm Miss Winters, Mr. Morgan's assistant. Please follow me." The interior of White Shore matched its exterior in grandeur. Soaring ceilings, original woodwork gleaming with the patina of age and care. Tasteful art that Ethan suspected might be worth more than his entire educational debt. Miss Winters led him through to a study where Richard Morgan stood before floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the lake, now silvered by early moonlight. "Ethan, thank you for coming," Richard said, turning from the view. "Can I offer you something?" "Coffee, perhaps? Or something stronger?" "Coffee is fine," Ethan replied, fighting the urge to shove his hands in his pockets like a nervous teenager. Richard nodded to Miss Winters, who departed silently. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to a seating area of leather armchairs arranged around a low table. Once seated, Ethan couldn't contain his curiosity any longer. "Why am I here, Mr. Morgan? I mean, I appreciate the interest in my project, but why would I care?" Richard finished for him, with that same hint of a smile from the diner. "Fair question. Direct, which I appreciate." He sat in the chair opposite Ethan's. "The truth is, I've been following your work for some time." Ethan blinked. "My work? I'm still a student." a student who published a remarkably innovative paper on biomimetic filtration systems in the Journal of Environmental Engineering last year. A student whose faculty advisor speaks of in terms usually reserved for established researchers. Heat rose in Ethan's face. "You've spoken to Professor Harmon?" "Among others," Richard confirmed as Ms. Winters returned with a tray bearing coffee and what appeared to be freshly baked cookies. After she'd served them and departed again, Richard continued, "What you may not know is that Meridian has a substantial interest in water infrastructure globally. Your approach to filtration using locally sourced materials aligns perfectly with initiatives we're developing in several regions." Ethan's mind raced. "So what? You want to buy my design?" The idea both thrilled and disturbed him. His project was meant to help people, not generate profit for a multinational corporation. Richard sipped his coffee, regarding Ethan over the rim. "Not exactly. I'm proposing something more collaborative. Meridian's resources combined with your innovation. Full credit to you as the designer, royalties on any commercial applications, and most importantly, immediate implementation in the regions that need it most." The offer hung in the air, tantalizing in its potential. Ethan's project, his mother's legacy in a way, actually helping communities like the one they'd visited in Guatemala. But years of struggle had taught him caution. "Why would you do this? There must be dozens of established researchers you could partner with." "Hundreds," Richard agreed readily. "But they lack what you have." "Which is what exactly?" "Purpose beyond profit. First-hand understanding of the problem. And quite frankly, a solution elegant in its simplicity." Richard set down his cup. "But there's something else. Something I recognized last night in that rain-soaked car." What's that?" Ethan asked, torn between skepticism and a growing hope he didn't quite trust. "Myself, 40 years ago." Silence fell between them, broken only by the gentle tick of an antique clock somewhere in the room. Ethan waited, sensing there was more to come. "I wasn't always Richard Morgan, CEO of Meridian Global." Richard continued after a moment. "I was Ricky Morgan from Clearwater Junction, son of a factory worker and a waitress. First in my family to attend college. On scholarship, working nights and weekends just like you." Ethan studied Richard's face, searching for any sign of manipulation or falsehood. He found none, only a quiet intensity that matched the man's words. "The rain last night," Richard went on, "was an inconvenience to you, but a gift to me. My driver took a wrong turn, then the car hydroplaned into a ditch. Cell service was non-existent. I started walking, thinking about how long it had been since I'd experienced true inconvenience, true discomfort." A faint smile touched his lips. "And then you stopped. Not because you recognized me or wanted something from me, but simply because it was the right thing to do." "Anyone would have stopped," Ethan murmured. "No," Richard said firmly. "They wouldn't. 17 cars passed me before yours." "I counted." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, unused to being cast as some kind of modern Good Samaritan. "So this is what, gratitude? A reward for being decent?" "This is opportunity recognizing merit," Richard corrected. "Your kindness opened the door, but your talent and determination are why we're having this conversation." He leaned forward slightly. "Let me be clear, I'm not offering charity. I'm offering partnership. Meridian would fund the development and implementation of your filtration system, with you leading the project. Full salary, benefits, flexible hours to complete your degree. In return, we get a proven technology that aligns with our global initiatives and the brilliance of a young engineer who might otherwise be lost to some corporate R&D department." It sounded too good to be true. The kind of miraculous intervention Ethan had stopped believing in years ago, when his mother's illness had drained their modest savings and left him alone to navigate an indifferent world. "I need time to think," he said finally. "Of course," Richard agreed immediately. "But while you're thinking, consider this. Sometimes life presents us with unexpected crossroads. The question isn't whether the opportunity is deserved, but whether you're prepared to step through the door when it opens." Ethan nodded slowly, his mind already racing through possibilities, calculations, potential pitfalls. "Now," Richard said, his tone lightening, "tell me more about the nanomaterials you're using. I found that aspect particularly fascinating." The conversation shifted to technical details, Richard's questions revealing a genuine understanding of the engineering principles involved. For the first time in years, Ethan found himself fully engaged intellectually, without the weight of exhaustion or financial worry pressing down on him. It was nearly midnight when Mr. Winters reappeared to remind Richard of an early conference call. Ethan started, shocked by how much time had passed. "I've kept you too late," Richard said, rising. "My apologies. The car will take you home." Ethan stood as well, suddenly awkward again. "Thank you for..." He gestured vaguely, encompassing the evening, the conversation, the possibilities that now stretched before him like an unexpected road. "Think about my offer," Richard said simply. "Take a week if you need it. My contact information is on the card I gave you." In the car, watching the lights of White Shore Estate recede behind them, Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced in a very long time. Hope, unguarded and expansive, like a tight fist finally unclenching. Ethan didn't need a week. He needed exactly 36 hours, time enough to research Meridian's global water initiatives, legitimate and substantial, speak with Professor Harmon, who nearly wept with excitement at the opportunity, and finally visit his mother's grave in the small cemetery on the outskirts of town. The stone was simple, all he could afford, but the location was beautiful, beneath a spreading oak that turned glorious shades of gold and crimson in autumn. Now, with winter approaching, its branches were nearly bare, reaching toward a pearl gray sky like supplicating hands. "Hey, Mom," Ethan said softly, brushing leaves from the base of the stone. "Something incredible happened. You won't believe it, but..." He told her everything. The rainy night, the hitchhiker, the revelation, the offer. The wind rustled through the remaining leaves as he spoke, a sound that had always reminded him of his mother's gentle laughter. "I think I'm going to say yes," he concluded. "It feels right, like maybe all the struggle was leading somewhere after all." He paused, swallowing against the tightness in his throat. "I wish you could see it. The system working, helping kids like the ones we met in Guatemala. That was always the dream, wasn't it?" The oak's shadow shifted slightly as clouds parted, allowing weak November sunlight to touch the headstone. Ethan wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I miss you," he whispered, "every day. But I think maybe you guided him to my car somehow. That's what I'm choosing to believe anyway." When he finally rose to leave, his decision was made. He pulled out his phone and the now creased business card, dialing the number with steady fingers. "Ms. Winters," answered on the second ring. "Mr. Morgan's office. This is Ethan James. I'd like to speak with Mr. Morgan, please." "One moment, Mr. James." Her tone held a warmth that hadn't been there before. Richard came on the line almost immediately. "Ethan, have you made a decision?" "Yes," Ethan said, looking back once more at his mother's grave. "I'm in..." When do we start?" 6 months later. The Guatemalan sun beat down relentlessly, but Ethan barely noticed, his attention fixed on the village square, where the filtration system, his system, was being installed. Children darted around the workers, their excitement palpable despite the language barrier. "They understand what this means," Richard said quietly, appearing at Ethan's side. Unlike their first meeting, he was dressed casually now in lightweight pants and a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up. The Billionaire CEO was nowhere in evidence. This was simply a man witnessing positive change. "Clean water changes everything," Ethan agreed, watching as one of the local engineers he'd trained adjusted a connection. "Health, education, opportunity, it all flows from this." In the 6 months since accepting Richard's offer, Ethan's life had transformed. He'd graduated with honors, moved into a modest but comfortable apartment near Meridian's research facility, and led the team refining and scaling his filtration system. This installation in Guatemala, the first of 12 planned for the region, was both a technical milestone and a deeply personal one. "Your mother would be proud," Richard said, somehow knowing exactly where Ethan's thoughts had gone. Ethan nodded, not trusting himself to speak. After a moment, he managed, "Thank you for all of this." Richard shook his head. "You earned it. I merely opened a door. You walked through it and built something remarkable." He paused, watching as water began to flow through the system for the first time, clear and safe. "Though I admit I did have an ulterior motive that night in the rain." Ethan turned to him, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I told you I was visiting a property." "That was true." Richard gestured toward the mountains visible in the distance. "My mother was from a village about 20 miles from here. She left at 17, worked her way north, eventually met my father in Texas, but she never forgot this place." Understanding dawned slowly. "You have a personal connection to the region." "More than that," Richard said. "I grew up hearing about the challenges here, water chief among them. When I saw your paper on biomimetic filtration, it felt like synchronicity." "So your car breaking down was genuine bad luck?" or perhaps fate, depending on your perspective. Richard smiled slightly. But I'd already planned to find you once I returned to Lakeside. Your stopping for me simply accelerated the timeline. A cheer went up from the gathered villagers as clean water gushed from the system's outlet pipe. Children rushed forward, hands outstretched to catch the precious resource that had been unreliable and dangerous for generations. Worth getting soaked for? Ethan asked, unable to keep the emotion from his voice as he watched their joy. Worth everything, Richard replied simply. As they stood there watching the culmination of both their journeys, one beginning, one perhaps nearing its completion, Ethan thought about all the invisible threads that connected moments and lives. His mother's work bringing him to Guatemala as a boy, her illness driving him to work through college, a rainy night in an act of simple kindness, a billionaire with his own connection to this distant place. Life rarely offered neat narratives or easy answers. Sometimes it delivered crushing blows that seemed senseless and cruel. But sometimes, just sometimes, it provided bridges across the impossible distances between who we are and who we might become. The water continued to flow, clean and clear and full of promise. Around them, a community celebrated. And in that moment, standing side by side, the poor student and the billionaire were simply two men watching hope made tangible, drop by precious drop.